How do you know you've lost something when you don't remember what it's like to have it anymore? Even more, how do you know what it's like to lose something when you never had it? This is the truth about spiritual sensitivity. When Paul and James and John are writing the New Testament, like it was a given. They understood that their readers would know what spiritual sensitivity was, what it was like. It didn't need to be talked about, although it is talked about in some degree. So when Paul makes statements in like 1 Corinthians chapter 2 that a spiritual man understands spiritual words, spiritual truths and spiritual words, and when the word spiritual is used in the New Testament, there was an assumption that a person knew what that meant. From my understanding, the real significant marker of the beginning of spiritual insensitivity was about 3,000 years ago. This is what Julian Jaynes calls the birth of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. He's in the 1970s, he released this book, and that's what it was called. And he makes this assessment looking at Greek manuscripts that about 3,000 years ago, it appears that most people heard the gods in their mind. He called the right brain the God side of the mind. It's where we heard the gods. We could, I think, not just hearing, but people back then could feel through their spiritual sensitivity the gods. And about 3,000 years ago, though, with Greek rationalism, was birthed the beginning of a different kind of human consciousness. So for the last 3,000 years, we've been moving out of spiritual sensitivity. But I think that began to be ramped up, or I think that was even more ramped up with the Protestant Reformation and the Industrial Revolution. These two factors really created a hyper insensitivity spiritually. The Protestant Reformation, if you don't know, was very anti-mystical. It was very anti-gifts of the Spirit. This is called cessationism. Cessationism was a Christian philosophy developed in the 16th century by church reformers, by Protestant reformers. They did not like the Catholic Church's inclusion of mysticism in any way, the idea of miracles and the working of the Spirit. And the Catholic Church had withdrawn from that to a degree when they split from the Eastern Orthodox. And so you have this slow progression over 3,000 years, and even within the church over 2,000 years, really, because the church was founded by the Spirit and the strong move of the Spirit, and by Jews who had a strong spiritual sensitivity to the Spirit and to spirits, right? Fast forward 2,000 years, introduce Greek philosophy, intellectualism of the last 500 years, hyper-intellectualism of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment era. And what you have today are people that have no idea what spiritual sensitivity is. They don't even know. When I tell you, hey, you need to learn to listen to the Spirit, you need to be more spiritually sensitive, it's like the adults on the Peanuts cartoons were like, wah, 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 wah. That's what it sounds like to you. I'm like, hey, spiritual sensitivity, and you hear, and yeah, I get it. It's been really hard for me to grow in my spiritual sensitivity because I started out so spiritually insensitive. I think that's a huge factor. I think that's something that needs to be explored more, a lot more thought put into it. The church is very unspiritual and anti-spiritual. That's a big problem. Why? Because the New Testament writers assumed that they were writing to people that had a base understanding and ability to be spiritually sensitive. Wow. It was like, okay, everybody is spiritually sensitive, so we don't really need to talk about it too much or explain it or diagram it or lay it out because everybody knows this. It's like the air we breathe. It was in the culture. It was just the culture of every person. Even pagan people were spiritually sensitive. They were sensitive and often following the wrong spirits, who were often disguising themselves as good when they weren't, but they had a spiritual sensitivity. There was a baseline understanding that everybody was spiritual and had a degree of spiritual sensitivity when the New Testament was written. And so it's like, that stuff wasn't written down. It was assumed, it was understood, and it was understood by the writers. Now, 2,000 years later, we're in the opposite position. We are not spiritually sensitive. We don't have that data. We don't have those models. We don't have that understanding. We don't know what it is. And it's not something that you can like, hey, here's the 5 point diagram. Here's the 5-step process. It's just like this, it's like that. It's a very intuitive thing. It's hard to talk about, it's hard to describe, it's hard to talk about, it's hard to describe, it's even harder to grow into. It's been very painful for me to grow into it. It's been very scary. Yeah, because you're opening yourself up to a spiritual reality you're not used to, and you're opening yourself up to feel things you're not used to feeling. We think we're a closed system, guys. That's the kind of the bottom line, and the big difference is the modern Western intellectual mind thinks we're a closed system, and all our emotions are internal and internalized and come from inside, and they're basically internal phenomenon. They're limbic system produced, endocrine produced, chemical produced feelings. That's what the modern Western mind thinks. Opposite 2,000 years ago. It was, we're an open system, we feel spiritual things from outside of us. That's a big difference between I'm a closed system and I don't feel anything outside of me to, no, I'm an open system and I feel a lot of things from outside of me, things I can't see, things from other people, things from other spiritual entities. That's a big difference. That translates to a big gap between the New Testament writers and where we live today. And that's something that, we need to continue just to talk about and address. It's an issue. So, anyway, how do you know when you've lost something that you've forgotten what it's like to have? How do you know when you never had it to begin with, what it's like? That's spiritual sensitivity, guys. But guess what? If you're a Christian, you have the Spirit. If you have the Spirit, you need to learn to walk with the Spirit, as Paul says in Galatians. And in Romans chapter 8, Paul says, all those who are being led by the Spirit, these are the sons and daughters of God. You can't be led by the Spirit if you don't know how to be spiritually sensitive. If you don't know how to be spiritually sensitive, that's a big problem. Can you really follow the principles of Christianity, the teachings of the New Testament, the way of Jesus? I don't think you can. All right. That's a big problem. That's really all I want to point out is we've got a big problem in the church today. This hyper-intellectual gospel ain't it. All right. See you guys. Love you. Bye.